But first, mink farming was once a high-flying industry in parts of Atlantic Canada. Back in 2012 and 2013, huge prices brought in tens of millions of dollars to rural communities. Then prices crashed in 2014, and 6 years on, the mink industry is in worse shape than ever. But there's another aspect to the collapse of the industry. On its way down, it has taken large amounts of public money with it. And the CBC's Richard Cuthbertson has been looking into this. He joins us now. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Bob.
Thanks for joining us. So take us back. Yes, lots of people know the mink industry was once a booming industry.
Yeah, well, mink farming has a century-old history in Atlantic Canada, particularly in Nova Scotia and places like Digby and Yarmouth counties. And it is a sector that has typically followed cycles of price rises and then price drops. But in 2012 and 2013, we saw something pretty incredible. We're talking upwards of $100 a pelt, and that's more than double what it costs to produce. And fueling all this was demand from the luxury fashion industry, particularly in China, where mink pelts were being turned into fur coats and other garments worth thousands of dollars.
So then what happened in 2014?
Yeah, well, these extraordinary prices prompted a massive ramping up of production, particularly in Europe and Asia, which account for the bulk of the world's mink pelts. And it got to the point where the market was pretty much awash in fur. Now, at the same time, Chinese purchasing slowed, and Russia, another large market, was hit by a financial crisis. Now, prices were going to have to drop. When they did, it was dramatic, crashing 75% or more.
And so 6 years later, where do we stand?
Yeah, well, initially there was hope that prices would recover in a couple of years. That has not happened. Last year was as bad as any. Peter Peters is a mink farmer in Howe Bay in eastern PEI. He's a 50-year veteran of the industry.
As a mink farmer, you like your farm, you're proud of your mink. You don't want to go out. I'd rather see my neighbor go broke than myself, let's be honest. But maybe it comes to this, that the whole industry is going to be in deep trouble.
Arguably, it already is in deep trouble.
Yeah, it is, yeah, for sure. And the unknown factor, if it is not going to work in the future, then you can take step and stop, right? But people like to hang on, right?
That's mink farmer Peter Peters. He still owns an operating mink farm in New Brunswick, but at 72, he has shut down the mink farm near his PEI home, in large part because of his age. The padlocked barn doors are a symbol, however, of what's happened across the sector. This is a sector that once employed several thousand people in Atlantic Canada. Many of those jobs are now gone. Dozens of farms have liquidated or gone bankrupt.
The other financial aspect of this story involves public money. What have you learned about that?
Yeah, well, a CBC analysis of bankruptcy and government records suggests that since 2014, upwards of $100 million in provincial and federal money has been spent in Canada trying, often unsuccessfully, to keep individual mink farms afloat or is tied up in loans by Crown lending agencies that will likely never be repaid. Now, one number from Statistics Canada suggests up to $85 million in federal and provincial money has been spent in Nova Scotia alone, making the mink sector by far and away the largest recipient of agricultural aid in the province. And, the other thing I should note is the precise data is hard to come by, and that's because the Federal Agriculture Department keeps much of it secret. It won't even release it under access to information laws. But what we do know is the bulk of that money has flowed from Agri-Stability, a program jointly funded by the provinces in Ottawa, and it amounts to a disaster relief subsidy for farmers who suffer large income declines.
That's a lot of money. So what's been the result?
Well, so steep and long has been the fall of the mink sector that last year farms in Canada sold just $44 million worth of pelts. So to put a fine point on it, we've got maybe $100 million in financial aid over 6 years for an industry now worth less than half of that.
So we have a lot of public money that's been poured into a sector that remains in very bad shape. What do the industry and politicians think about that?
Well, this is an industry that is not without controversy, particularly a few years ago related to concerns that waste runoff from farms was polluting local waterways, and that prompted new environmental standards in Nova Scotia. It's also faced a determined campaign from animal rights activists. But defenders of the payments to the industry point to this. Before the bust, Mink brought in $130 million of foreign money into rural Nova Scotia in a single year. The industry was by far the province's largest agricultural export. Now, there's another thing here, and that is that agri-stability is a pan-Canadian program. The mink industry is simply tapping into something available to other agricultural sectors that have faced severe income declines. But the question is whether ultimately all that money was worth it. Here's Nova Scotia Agriculture Minister Keith Caldwell.
So probably, maybe not. Maybe it wasn't a good investment at the time, but it was a program that's there for all the industry. So they accessed the program. So could I make a decision whether it was a good investment time? It was beyond my authority. And even in the federal level, it's beyond their authority. It's a program that was negotiated across the country with all the agricultural products, and that program was there, and it's really helped tremendously in the industry, not just the mink industry, but across all avenues of the industry. So it's like having an insurance policy. Should you have sold it to somebody or not? And the answer is yes, you should have. But it just happened that that might have been a bad investment because your claims are too high.
Nova Scotia Agriculture Minister Keith Caldwell.
All right, and the industry, what about it?
Well, for them, it's obviously not gone as planned. Mink farmer Peter Peters says nobody could have predicted that the downturn would be this long.
I mean, there are far fewer farms now. There are far fewer pelts. The industry really is
crumbling.
So was agri-stability ultimately a failure in this case? Because it didn't actually save an industry.
No. I always said Canada would be the only country in the world to survive because of agri-stability, but I was wrong. It didn't.
Now, that's mink farmer Peter Peters. He does note payments taper off after a few bad years. So those farms that have survived, many are no longer receiving government money.
Are there particular examples, Richard, that stand out where farms have received large amounts of public money?
Yeah, sure. You know, there's one Nova Scotia farm that is in insolvency proceedings for a second time, even after receiving more than $4 million in aid. In another case, agri-stability money went to a Toronto financial institution that lost millions of dollars to a bankrupt mink operation in Weymouth, Nova Scotia. And on the flip side, in that case, the Nova Scotia Farm Loan Board, which is a Crown agency, had to write off $1.4 million in loans to the farm. There's also a particularly intriguing example from PEI.
What happened there?
Well, it involves an operation on the western part of the island called Silver Hill Fur Farm that was facing bankruptcy in March 2017. The owner in that case said he had killed the last of his herd, but that the pelts, $20,000, worth as much as $1 million, had all been ruined. So he claimed he put them all through a meat grinder and flushed the lot right into the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
That seems unbelievable.
Yeah, it does seem a little unbelievable. And, you know, accountants brought in after the farm went into receivership suspected the mink had instead been killed a month earlier, according to court records, and the pelts shipped off island, apparently away from the prying eyes of creditors. But at the center of this story is also a lot of public money. In bankruptcy, the farm took with it $4 million in PEI government loans and at least $3.5 million in agri-stability payments over several years.
So troubled times. What does the future hold for the mink industry?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I suppose it depends on who you ask. Keith Caldwell, Nova Scotia's agriculture minister, remains a supporter. In March, he said he thinks the pelt glut is over.
So we really have to market in a different approach. We're taking a total different approach in how we're going to market. We're going to market more directly to the users, the fashion houses in the world that would use this high-quality product. So we're going to change how we do business. And the industry has been great to work with. So they see a change coming. But for so long, if you do a commodity, you don't make any money. And mink was a commodity. So we got to change that attitude. We've got a high-quality product we can sell internationally, and it really is a good product. So as we change and we evolve this whole process, the industry will be smaller than it ever was for a long time, but it'll be a stronger industry.
And so that's Nova Scotia Agriculture Minister Keith Caldwell. As you heard, he is optimistic about what he calls this product. A product, of course, that's also received millions of dollars in government aid.
All right. Well, thanks for this, Richard.
Yes, no problem.
That was the CBC's Richard Cuthbertson. And by the way, you can read more about this story. Just head to cbc.ca/ns.